Hi there, and welcome to this student webinar looking at ethical implications and social sensitivity. Now, to begin with, there are three different things we want to look at in this evening's webinar. We'll start by looking at the definitions and examples of exactly what we mean by ethical implications and social sensitivity. In the second part of the webinar, we'll look at the types of questions that could arise in this part of the course, and then we'll finish in the final 10 minutes or so by looking at a potential essay question that could come up, discuss ethical implications of research studies and theory, including reference to social sensitivity. It's quite a long essay title. So let's start with the definitions, and actually a useful starting point is to consider two other definitions that you're familiar with that aren't in this particular topic. You've come across ethical guidelines before, and these are a set of principles set out by the British Psychological Society to help psychologists behave honestly and with integrity, okay? And those are the guidelines that you're really familiar with, things like protection from harm, right to withdraw, etc. Ethical issues, on the other hand, another term you're really familiar with, are the issues that arise when there is a conflict between the rights of the participant and the aims of the researcher. More simply put, ethical issues typically arise when a psychologist breaks one of those ethical guidelines, like protection from harm, right to withdraw, and so forth. What's important for this particular webinar is we're not actually really considering ethical guidelines and issues. We're considering something new, which is ethical implications, which actually goes one step further than an ethical issue. So where an ethical issue considers the issues that arise when a researcher breaks ethical guidelines in the experiment, ethical implications actually consider the research in a wider context. How might those findings of the study affect a wider group of people that didn't take part necessarily in the research? Okay. Now, to begin with, let's get a definition for ethical implications. So it says on the screen there that ethical implications consider the impact or the consequence that research has on the rights of other, and really important that the word other is there, other people in a wider context, not just the people taking part in the research itself. I've put the specification at the top of the screen because the specification actually says that you need to understand ethical implications of research studies, and we're going to use Milgram as an example in a minute, and theories, and I'm going to use Bolbys Theory of attachment. So you need to be clear that when thinking about this particular topic, you need to understand these implications in relation to actually both studies and theories, okay? Now, let's look at Milgrams Research and actually consider the ethics of Milgrams Research, okay? So I've put there the question, did the ends justify the means? So if we think about what went on in Milgrams Research in terms of ethical issues, first of all, okay, and I stress issues there. The participants were deceived, okay? They weren't able to provide fully informed consent, and many of them found it very, very distressing, the experience itself, okay? However, all of the participants were debriefed, and they took part in follow-up interviews, and many of the participants said that they suffered no long-term effects, okay? Therefore, if we're thinking just about the issues at this stage, we could argue, okay, that the findings justify the way the research was conducted because the research is actually useful for society to determine the different factors that affect obedience. So we might say the ethical implications, the wider impact of this research is actually positive because we now start to understand why some people may obey orders that they don't want to obey, okay? So I might say for now that the ethical implications of this study are actually pretty good. Let's consider a different approach now. Let's look at the theories, Bolbys Theory of attachment. And you might be wondering at this stage, well, how on earth can a theory itself have any ethical issues or implications involved, okay? Now, Bolbys Theory argued that children form a special attachment bond, usually with their mother, that takes place during a critical period of development. Okay, and Bolby also argued that this attachment bond affects their future relationships through an internal working model. Now, there's nothing wrong with Bolby's theory, so there's no ethical issues with the theory. But if we think about how that might be applied, the implications of that, while Bolby's researchers contributed to the development of childcare practices, and that in itself is very, very good, it has also encouraged the view that a woman's place is at home with her children that might make some mothers feel guilty for wanting to return to work following childbirth. And that is the implication. So while his actual theory might be quite innocent, the implication of his theory is that it could have negative effects on mothers who feel guilty as a result for wanting to return to work. And that's really what we mean by implications, is that considering the wider context of either the studies or the theories that we're talking about. To add to that, okay, there is another term that you need to be aware of, which is the idea of social sensitivity, okay? And Cyber and Stanley were the first people to use the term social sensitivity, and they use this term to describe studies and theories where there are particular social consequences for the people in the study, the participants, or the group of people they represent, okay? If we now go back to our Milgram example, although I said actually I didn't think at the time there were that severe ethical implications, it's a pretty good study. If we was to flip that around now, we could argue that Milgrams Research is really socially sensitive, because actually you could apply the results in a different way to ensure that people do obey orders, including orders they don't want to follow. So there is actually a sensitive area around Milgrams Research that we need to be aware of. Okay, so this area, obedience, is a socially sensitive area that could have severe ethical implications. Likewise, if we consider Bolby again, we could argue that Bolbys' theory of attachment is again very sensitive for the reasons I've already mentioned, because it could be used in a way to coerce mothers to stay at home and look after their children. Okay, it could be used really as sort of a sense of blackmail, make them feel guilty. Okay, now with that in mind, we now see how actually those theories and studies that we've looked at could be a socially sensitive area that have very serious ethical implications. Okay, and there we have it summarised on the screen. Now, Cyber and Stanley went one step further. Okay, they actually identified 4 parts of the research process that raise important ethical implications in socially sensitive areas. Okay, so if a particular area of study is socially sensitive, like obedience, like attachment, Cyber and Stanley said, well, there's 4 things that researchers really need to consider before they conduct their research. Okay, ideally before anyway. The first thing they need to consider is the research question. Okay, so the researcher must consider their question carefully, because some research questions, and I've put an example on the screen there, for example, are there racial differences in IQ, or is intelligence inherited, could be damaging for members of that particular group. Okay, so actually just the way we phrase the research question could be an issue in psychology if it's phrased in a very leading type of way. The second thing we need to consider is the methodology used, okay, and this is where your real ethics come in. So researchers really need to consider the treatment of their participants and their right to things like confidentiality and anonymity in particular. There's a really interesting sort of debate here that if someone was to admit to committing a crime in a study, should the researchers still maintain their confidentiality, or should they pass that information on, okay? Third thing, and you won't have considered this before I'd imagine, is the idea of the institutional context. So the researcher needs to be mindful about how their data is going to be used, and actually a little bit more than that, who's funding their research. So if the research is actually being funded by a private institution, or even the government, why are they funding that research, and why do they want those findings? What are they going to use those findings for afterwards? So researchers need to be mindful of that, and you'll see a great example of that in a moment. Last but not least, and this really follows on, is the researchers need to consider how their findings could be interpreted and applied to the real world, and could their data be used in any way to shape or form policy or law, and that's important. So Cyber and Stanley outline these 4 areas, that if the area is socially sensitive, and I'll argue later on that nearly everything in psychology is to some extent socially sensitive, researchers need to be considering the research question, the method used, the context, and the interpretation and application of those findings, okay? Now with that in mind, I want to share with you an example that you're going to find hopefully quite interesting. Cyril Burt, or Sir Cyril Burt, was a psychologist who studied identical twins to support his view that intelligence is genetic. Okay, so he studied identical twins that were separated at birth, and he found that actually it didn't matter where they were raised, they typically had similar IQs, which led him to the belief that intelligence is something we inherit. Now his views and his research greatly influenced the Hadro report in 1926, which years later led to the creation of the 11+ entrance examination, which from the years of 1944 to 1976 meant that on the basis of a test that children took when they were 11 years old, determined whether they went into a selective grammar school if they passed the test and they were deemed as more intelligent, or they went to a comprehensive school if they weren't deemed academic enough to attend the grammar school. So this meant that generations of children, generations upon generations of children, were affected by the 11+ exam results. Now what's particularly interesting is it later transpired that he actually made all of his data up, and some people believe he even made up the names of the other researchers that were present on the paper when it was published. Okay, if we now sort of work backwards from here, so this is clearly a sensitive area. He may not have intended it to be used this way, but it clearly was. Thinking of our 4 steps, Cyril Burt should have considered that research question really carefully, okay? Examining whether intelligence is genetic could have serious consequences if we find out that it is, okay? He should have also really considered the methodology he used, okay? In this particular case, he made up his data, which really shows that he didn't really consider the methodology that considerably, okay? He should have considered the institutional context. Now, at the time, he was working for the University of Liverpool, but he was also working for London County Council, and therefore there was a good chance that the London County Council might use that data in some way, okay? Most importantly in his case, and I would argue probably the most important here, is that he should have considered the implications of his findings, which were used in this case to inform public policy and actually create a test that actually shaped the lives of generations and generations of children, okay? So you can see why these 4 stages are so important, okay? So there we have it. We've got our definition of ethical implications, which is the impact or consequences that research has on the rights of people in a wider context, not just the participants. You need to be aware of it in terms of research studies and theories, and then finally you need to be aware of this area called socially sensitive research, which is any area where there are potential social consequences for participants or the group of people. Following that, you also need, it would be really useful to know Cyber and Stanley's 4 sort of steps in how we should approach socially sensitive research in terms of the research question, the method used, the context, and the interpretation and application of findings. Okay. Now let's move on to our second part, looking at the different types of questions that could come up in this part of the exam. So you could get a short answer question, application question, essay question, and even a multiple choice potentially, but let's look at the more tricky questions. Short answer question might just be explain what is meant by socially sensitive research. Okay. Application question, briefly explain how researchers could have dealt with the issue of social sensitivity in this study, and I'll show you a study in a minute. And then of course there is the essay question, discuss ethical implications of research studies and or theory, include reference to social sensitivity. So let's take those one by one. Explain what is meant by the term socially sensitive research. Watch out for the fact that that's 3 marks for that definition question. So there needs to be kind of 3 points that you're making within your answer. I would say here the term socially sensitive research is used to describe studies where there are potential social consequences for the participants or the group of people they represent. Now that's a spot on definition. It doesn't feel enough to me to get the 3rd mark, so I would throw in an example here just to make sure, okay, that we are picking up those marks. For example, Milgrams' study could be considered socially sensitive because the results could be used to ensure that other people obey orders, including those they don't wish to follow. So I'm just following that with an example to make sure I pick up all of those marks. Now, quite interesting in this area, because actually going back to the specification that I mentioned earlier, it says explain what's meant by socially sensitive. I also think that you could get questions that might say, give an example of research that's socially sensitive, or give an example of a theory that is socially sensitive, because the specification actually demands those things anyway. So just keep that in mind, that if it says of a theory, you want to be using something like Bolbys Theory or any of your Year 2 theories. If it says a research study, then you're looking at something like Milgram, okay? Let's now take a look at that application question. So the question is briefly discuss or briefly explain how researchers could have dealt with the issues of social sensitivity in this study. Now the study is here. So in a study of antisocial activity and social background, the researchers have interviewed 100 children aged 14 years. They then classified each child according to their level of antisocial activity. They concluded that 26 were very antisocial, 40 were mildly antisocial, and 34 were not very antisocial. The researchers found that the majority of the very antisocial children attended Crayford Secondary School, whereas most of the other 2 groups attended another local school. Now there's only one thing in that extract that jumps out at me deliberately, which I think the examiners want us to use, and they've named the school there, okay? So straight away, when we think back to our methodology point, they've not maintained confidentiality of that particular school. With that in mind, there's not a lot else in that extract that we could probably use to answer that particular exam question. So this is another application question where you're required to go beyond the extract, okay? Let's think about how we might use Cyber and Stanley's 4 steps. And we only need a couple of them, so it's 4 marks to answer that question. Now I've crossed out the research question because there's no mention of the research question there, so we're not going to be referring to that. And I've crossed out the institutional context because we don't know who this researcher was working for. So there's definitely something within the methodology used and the interpretation and the application of findings that we could talk about here to get our 4 marks for this question, okay? So an answer might look like this. The researchers need to be aware of the methodology they use, including the treatment of the participants and their right to confidentiality and anonymity. In order to deal with the issue of social sensitivity, the researchers need to ensure that they don't publish the names of any students or the school, which they have done in this extract because they've named it as Crayford Secondary School. So that's the method part. They could have done more around the method to ensure that this socially sensitive area was dealt with. Moving on from that, we could also think about the application and interpretations of the findings. And this is the interesting bit. So I said there that furthermore, the researchers need to consider the application of the findings, which could have a negative impact on the students involved, okay, the school and the wider community. The example or the findings could lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy where the students think that their school is antisocial and the results become more antisocial, okay. What's quite interesting here is if you think about this in real life context, that's exactly what happens in terms of schools now. Ofsted, the governing body that goes around schools and inspects them, go into schools and they rate schools on outstanding, good, or requires improvement. Now, if you're given a label of unsatisfactory or requires improvement, that can have a negative impact. So actually, this type of thing does occur in everyday life anyway, which is what makes this application question quite interesting. Okay. Then we have the whole answer together, just so you can see it on one slide. But that's how I would tackle that particular question. Don't have to write a lot, but have to think carefully. Quite a tricky application question. Moving on to the essay writing now. So let's imagine we get that question. Discuss ethical implications of research studies and theories. Include reference to social sensitivity. As always, we know that an essay we're looking at around 20 minutes worth of work, 500 words, of which roughly speaking about 175 is our knowledge, 325 is our evaluation. With that in mind, what might this particular essay look like? I'd start with all my AO1 here. I would define ethical implications, and there's so much to say, but I would outline Cyber and Stanley's 4 considerations of socially sensitive research. And here's what it might look like in about 175 words. So ethical implications can occur at any stage of the research process, not only the moment of actually conducting the research. You'll see from the examiner commentary that I've put there that I've said while the outline of ethical implications is correct, a better definition could be used here because this answer hasn't really defined ethical implications. So they could have added ethical implications consider the impact or consequences that research has on the rights of other people in a wider context. That would have been better, but that's not detracted too much from the answer. The answer goes on to say that Cyber and Stanley outlined 4 aspects of research process that raise ethical implications, especially in socially sensitive research. Firstly, the research question should not add to any prejudice or stereotype. For example, the belief that intelligence is inherited, so I've used the example from earlier. Secondly, the information obtained should be treated with confidentiality before, during and after the research process. Thirdly, if the research is being funded by the government or an institution, the researcher should ensure that the data is not misused in any way. And finally, the researcher should ensure that the interpretation of the data or findings has no impact on the people involved and the group of people that the participants represent. According to Cyber and Stanley, if researchers follow those considerations, then the research is less likely to have any social consequences for the participants themselves and the group of people those participants represent. So nice little outline there, nice and contained. Okay, so we've said there, we've outlined our ethical implications. Now we want to move on to, okay, how might we evaluate an essay like this? And you're going to need 3 points or so, 3 novel points here. So I'm going to first of all talk about the idea of issues of discrimination. Okay, and that's a real negative, that actually the problem with socially sensitive research is it can lead to issues with discrimination. I'm going to then counter that and say, well, actually, a lot of socially sensitive research, especially in the area of eyewitness testimony, is really, really positive because we now know how to improve the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. And then the final, really a question more, actually I'm going to pose is, well, therefore, should we conduct socially sensitive research? Some researchers argue that we shouldn't because of all the issues I've outlined in this webinar. Others say, well, actually we should because if we didn't do it, there'd be no research to carry out. Okay. Let's start by looking at that first one, issues of discrimination. And how you might structure a point here is you might say that socially sensitive research can lead to issues of discrimination, and therefore some psychologists would argue against conducting this form of research. Here's a really good example for illustrative purposes. Okay, for example, between 1907 and 1963, over 64,000 people were forcibly sterilised under eugenic legislation in the United States. And in 1972, the United States Senate Committee revealed that at least 2,000 involuntary sterilisations had been performed on poor black women without their consent or knowledge. Okay. Now, at the time, that could be justified by flawed research findings, okay, which argued that black Americans had a lower IQ in comparison to white Americans, highlighting a serious issue with socially sensitive research. So that clearly is a massive problem with conducting socially sensitive research if the findings are used in such a way. Moving on from that, we might talk about the real-world application of the findings and actually a strength, okay? So you might say that it's important to recognise that not all socially sensitive research is controversial, and some is actually quite good for society. For example, research examining eyewitness testimony, especially use of child witnesses, has found that young children can be reliable eyewitnesses if questioned in both a timely and appropriate manner. Okay. In this area, socially sensitive research has resulted in a good relationship between psychologists and legal professionals to help improve the accuracy and validity of child eyewitnesses. Okay, so there's your strength. I'm not going to talk to you about the third one because actually that's for you to make your argument. Well, should we conduct the research or not? Because actually some psychologists say no, we shouldn't be conducting research into socially sensitive areas because it is too sensitive and the consequences can be so great. For example, earlier, what we said about the racial discrimination. Others say, well, hang on, if we didn't conduct socially sensitive research, we'd do no research at all. We'd be left to research really dull areas of psychology, which is my view. My conclusion here would be that we should conduct it, but what we should be doing is taking into account Cyber and Stanley's four processes that we need to consider before we conduct the research. As always, this is what the essay looks like. So you can see I've got my AO1 as 2 discrete paragraphs, about 175 words, and then 3 or 4 paragraphs, 4 in this particular case, of evaluation coming in at 588 words. Bit too long, so you wouldn't need all 4 of those evaluation points, but if you use this essay later, what you'll find is that actually you could take one of those out and you'd be around the right length, okay? So there we have it. We've covered the ethical implications and social sensitivity, looked at definitions, looked at a tricky application question, how you might structure an essay. Hope you found that useful. There's more videos for psychology on YouTube, so if you search for Tutor to You on YouTube, you'll find plenty more videos like this. Or if you want to get more information from us, you can sign up to our Facebook group or Twitter address at Tutor to You site and keep in touch with us that way. Hope you found that useful and see you again soon. Thank you.